Are you seriously trying to argue law without a license? The judge smirked, his gavel tapping like punctuation on a bad joke. That one line would have crushed most people, but not Malika Rivers. She wasn't a lawyer. She was a grieving daughter, fighting to save her late mother's home from a billion-dollar bank, and somehow, she did what teams of attorneys couldn't. She exposed a fraud hiding in plain sight. In a courtroom where power usually speaks louder than truth, Malika turned the tables. Her story isn't fiction, it's a wake-up call, like Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. Sometimes the quietest people cause the loudest change. If you think ordinary people can't make history, this video might just change your mind. Watch till the end. And if this story makes you feel something, anger, hope, pride, don't forget to comment, subscribe, and join the movement. Your voice matters here. Judge Evans leaned back in his leather chair, eyeing her like she didn't belong. His gavel tapped the bench lightly, more out of habit than necessity. Miss Rivers, are you representing yourself today? He asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Yes, Your Honor, Malika replied, her voice steady. A soft chuckle rippled through the courtroom. From the other side of the aisle, Clarissa Dunn, lead attorney for the plaintiff and known bulldog in real estate litigation, smirked and whispered something to her paralegal. Malika heard it. This'll be over before lunch. She didn't flinch. She'd spent months preparing for this moment. Her mother's house, the same one she grew up in, where they shared Christmas mornings and birthday dinners, had been taken after what the bank claimed was a valid foreclosure. But Malika had found something they hadn't expected, a lie buried in the fine print. Judge Evans sighed and shuffled through the file in front of him. Foreclosure dispute, he muttered. I assume the plaintiff followed all standard procedures? Dunn stood.
Absolutely, Your Honor. All documents are in order.
The mortgage was defaulted, and due process was followed. Miss Rivers, while sympathetic, is simply trying to delay the inevitable. That's not true, Malika said, stepping forward slightly. My mother was in the hospital when that final signature was filed. And that signature? It's not hers. I'm claiming fraud, Malika said, letting the word hang in the air. That word shifted the energy in the room. The judge straightened. The jury leaned in, and Dunn's smile twitched. Malika continued. I've spent the past 5 months reviewing every document tied to this foreclosure, and what I found isn't just a clerical error, it's a pattern. Clarissa Dunn objected. Your Honor, this is speculative. She's not qualified to assess legal documents. She's a programmer. Malika turned to her calm but fierce. You're right. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read data, and I know when something doesn't add up. Judge Evans tapped his gavel once. Miss Rivers, unless you have something concrete. I do. Malika walked to the evidence table, retrieved a folder, and handed it to the bailiff. These are 2 versions of the mortgage agreement. Same document, but the signatures are different. And the second one, it was signed the day after my mother was admitted to the ICU. She couldn't speak, let alone sign her name. The judge examined the documents, his brow furrowing. They don't match. And there's more, Malika said. The mortgage changed hands 3 times in 18 months, and the last transfer doesn't have a valid endorsement, which means the bank that foreclosed on Mom's house never actually owned the debt. Now the room was silent. Clarissa's confidence cracked. Your Honor, these claims need to be verified. They will be, Judge Evans said, his tone sharper now. He turned back to Malika. Do you have any evidence regarding the transfer? Yes. And a witness? Clarissa spun toward her. You didn't disclose any witnesses. Malika's voice was steady. I found her yesterday. She worked at the bank, and she's ready to testify. The judge looked at her, surprised. Then he nodded slowly. We'll hear from her after lunch recess. As the courtroom began to empty, Malika sat down, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. They had expected her to fold, to break, to back down, but they didn't know her. They didn't know that her mother taught her to fight with her mind. They didn't know how many nights she stayed up cross-referencing mortgage databases and notary logs, and they sure as hell didn't know that beneath her quiet demeanor was a storm, ready to erupt. Malika glanced toward Clarissa Dunn, who now avoided her gaze. This was just the beginning. The courtroom settled after lunch, but the tension was thicker than before. Word had already spread through the courthouse halls. Some girl with no legal degree had managed to rattle Clarissa Dunn, the undefeated corporate attorney. But Malika Rivers wasn't thinking about that. She sat still, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the witness door. Her only thought, please show up. The bailiff's voice echoed, next witness, Linda Barrett. The door creaked open. A woman in her late 50s stepped through, wearing a modest navy blouse and gray slacks. Her steps were hesitant, her expression nervous. She clutched her purse, a shield. Malika stood. Ms. Barrett, thank you for coming. Clarissa Dunn shot up. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed during discovery and cannot be considered credible under such short notice. Judge Evans didn't even look at her. Overruled. Miss Rivers, proceed, but you're responsible for what comes next. Malika nodded and turned to Linda. Can you please state your name and occupation for the court? Linda Barrett. I was a mortgage operations assistant at Unified National Bank for 13 years. Do you recognize this document? Malika held up a copy of the mortgage modification, the one with the questionable signature. Linda took a deep breath. Yes. I scanned that into our system. It came across my desk last year. Were you there when the borrower, my mother, signed it? Linda hesitated, then shook her head. No, I wasn't. A soft murmur broke in the gallery. Malika pressed on. Then, how did the document come to be notarized? Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. Our manager at the time, Stephen Mahoney, brought it in and said, just file it. We've already got the stamp. I asked if it had been signed in person. He said, don't ask questions you don't want the answer to. Clarissa shot to her feet. Hearsay, Your Honor. She's making accusations without proof. Judge Evans raised his hand. Sit down, Miss Dunn. Let her finish. Malika stepped closer to the stand. Did you notarize the document, Miss Barrett? No, Linda replied, but I filed it knowing it hadn't been properly signed, and I've regretted it ever since. Silence. It was the kind of silence that cracks a room in half. Judge Evans leaned forward, looking directly at Linda. Do you understand the legal consequences of what you're saying? Yes, she said. But it's the truth. Malika turned toward the judge, her voice firmer now. Your Honor, this document was used to justify seizing my mother's home while she was hospitalized. It was filed without legal authority, and the party that foreclosed never legally owned the mortgage note. Judge Evans glanced down at the documents on his bench. You mentioned multiple transfers. Do you have evidence? Malika walked to the evidence table and picked up a stapled packet. 3 mortgage assignments over an 18-month period. Only the first 2 are properly endorsed. The final one? No signature, no notary, no legal standing. The judge's brow furrowed deeper with each page he turned. Clarissa stood again, clearly rattled. Your Honor, even if there were inconsistencies, it doesn't mean the foreclosure wasn't lawful. We followed protocol. You followed profit, Malika snapped before she could stop herself. Judge Evans didn't reprimand her. He simply tapped his finger against the bench, eyes narrowing at Clarissa. Miss Dunn, can your client provide the original wet ink documents for all transfers and the final mortgage note? Clarissa hesitated. We would need time to retrieve those. Malika exhaled slowly. She hadn't even realized she'd been holding her breath. The judge was no longer smirking. The jury wasn't looking through her anymore. And Clarissa Dunn, once so smug, now avoided her gaze. As the court recessed for the day, Malika gathered her things. She didn't smile. Not yet. There was still more to prove. But for the first time since the nightmare began, she didn't feel like she was shouting into the void. I'm sorry I waited so long, she said quietly. Linda gave her a faint smile. You should have been a lawyer. Then she walked down the steps, Her shoulders no longer weighed down by doubt, but lifted by purpose. This wasn't just about her mother's house anymore. It was about how many other families had been silently crushed the same way. And she was just getting started. Malika stood outside the courthouse the next morning, a warm coffee in one hand and a stack of worn-out documents in the other. She had slept barely 4 hours, her mind replaying every moment of yesterday's hearing. The witness testimony had shaken the courtroom, but Malika knew better than to celebrate too early. Corporations like Unified National Bank didn't go down without a fight. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back sharper. Judge Evans entered and took his seat. "Good morning. Let's continue," he said curtly, flipping open his binder. Clarissa stood first. "Your Honor, my client has brought the original documents in question. We assert that the final mortgage transfer is valid and enforceable under federal and state guidelines. Any procedural mishaps were minor and not grounds to void foreclosure." Malika raised her hand slightly. "Permission to review the originals?" Clarissa passed them to the bailiff, who handed them over. Malika opened the first envelope slowly. Her eyes scanned the paper. Her breath caught. The final transfer document still had no signature, no notary stamp, just a typed name and date. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the page, "this document is incomplete. It confirms what I said yesterday. Unified National Bank never legally acquired this mortgage." Clarissa didn't wait. "Your Honor, we request to enter a motion to dismiss the defendant's claims. This entire narrative is based on technicalities and unqualified assumptions. Miss Rivers has no standing to interpret complex legal instruments." Malika turned to the judge, her voice calm but resolute. "Then let's hear from someone who is qualified." Judge Evans raised an eyebrow. "You have another witness?" Malika nodded. "Yes, a former state banking auditor." Clarissa jumped in. "This is turning into a circus." Evans shot her a glare. "Counselor, enough." The bailiff opened the side door, and a tall man in his 60s walked in, clean cut in a pressed blazer, holding a leather binder. He introduced himself as Marcus Dean, former auditor, the state's Office of Financial Regulation. "Mr. Dean," Malika asked, "did you have a chance to review the mortgage chain documents I submitted to the court?" "Yes," he replied, flipping open his binder, "and I can say with confidence that the final transfer fails to meet the legal requirements for debt assignment. There's no endorsement, no verification, and no record of regulatory compliance." Clarissa's client shifted uncomfortably. Dean continued, "In fact, I've seen this exact structure used in multiple cases. I've flagged for investigation cases where homes were foreclosed without the lender having clear title to the debt." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Evans looked up slowly. "Are you suggesting systemic fraud?" "I'm saying it warrants further investigation," Dean said firmly. Clarissa stood, visibly rattled. "Your Honor, this is unfair. We've followed protocol." Evans didn't respond immediately. He read through Dean's binder page by page. The silence dragged on. Finally, he spoke. "This is no longer a simple foreclosure case. I'm placing a temporary injunction on the foreclosure order. The court will review the legitimacy of Unified National's mortgage transfers in full." Malika sat back, heart pounding. She hadn't won yet, but this was the breakthrough she needed. Clarissa turned to her client, whispering harshly. He shook his head and buried his face in his hands. As court adjourned, Judge Evans looked at Malika. "You may not be a lawyer, Miss Rivers, but you sure know how to present a case." Malika gave a small nod. "My mom deserved better than what they did to her. I wasn't going to let them bury the truth." Outside, the air felt different, brighter, cleaner. A young black law student approached her on the steps, holding a legal pad. "I watched your case. That was incredible. You made me believe we can actually win against people like them." Malika smiled. "You can, but it takes grit and receipts." As she walked down the steps again, a quiet sense of clarity settled over her. This wasn't just about her mother's house anymore. This was about a system built to intimidate, confuse, and crush people like her. But not today. Not anymore. And certainly not tomorrow. The courthouse was more crowded than usual. Word had spread beyond the building. People from the neighborhood, community organizers, even a few local journalists had shown up. Malika Rivers walked in, her jaw set, her heart pounding but her posture unshakable. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. And now, it was public. Judge Evans entered with less of the smugness he'd worn on day one. He scanned the courtroom, taking in the unusually packed gallery before speaking. Let's proceed. Clarissa Dunn rose with a different energy, one that masked desperation with forced confidence. Your Honor, the plaintiff maintains that the foreclosure was executed based on the documentation available at the time. Any missing endorsements or notarizations were inadvertent clerical issues, not fraud. Malika stood slowly. With respect, Your Honor, that explanation doesn't hold up when the same clerical issues appear in dozens of other foreclosures by this bank, mostly in black and low-income neighborhoods. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Judge Evans narrowed his eyes. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Malika nodded. Yes, I do. She handed a thick manila folder to the bailiff. These are records from 14 foreclosure cases over the past 2 years. Same bank, same missing endorsements, same fabricated notary stamps. Clarissa objected. Your Honor, this is inflammatory and irrelevant to the current case. Evans shook his head. No, it's not. If a pattern of misconduct exists, the court has a duty to review it.
Malika stepped forward. There's one more thing, Your Honor. I filed a FOIA request with the state's Office of Financial Regulation. Yesterday I received confirmation that Unified National Bank is currently under preliminary review for mortgage fraud.
That landed like a thunderclap. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment. Judge Evans leaned back, rubbing his temple. Is this verified? I have the official email. It's in the evidence packet. Malika replied. Clarissa turned to her client, whispering furiously. He stared straight ahead, pale and rigid. Judge Evans looked over the courtroom, then fixed his gaze on Malika. Do you believe this foreclosure was part of a deliberate pattern? Yes, she said, voice unwavering. I believe they target vulnerable homeowners, people unlikely to fight back. People like my mother. Rising from her seat, Malika pulled out a final piece of evidence. A notarized statement from a former loan officer at Unified National. In it, employee admitted to receiving bonuses for accelerated foreclosure closures, often at the expense of due process. Clarissa's face turned red. Objection. That statement hasn't been authenticated. Evans raised a hand. Overruled. The court will admit the statement into the record for review. The tension reached its boiling point. Your Honor, Malika said, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. My mother died, thinking she had failed. But she didn't fail. This system failed Durer. And if I have to be the one to hold it accountable, so be it. Silence. Then the judge spoke. His voice quiet, but clear. Miss Rivers, I have presided over hundreds of foreclosure cases. Rarely have I seen a defendant come to court with more evidence, more preparation, or more conviction than you have. Effective immediately, the foreclosure order is vacated, and the property is to be returned to the estate of Jeanette Rivers. Applause erupted before the bailiff called for order. Even Judge Evans allowed a small nod of approval. Clarissa slumped into her chair. Her client got up and left the courtroom without a word. Malika stood still, as if frozen, the words still sinking in. Her home, her mother's home, was safe. Outside the courthouse, the media waited. Reporters called her name. Microphones stretched toward her. But Malika didn't stop. Not yet. She walked to the edge of the steps and looked out over the crowd that had gathered. Thank you for being here, she said, projecting her voice. This wasn't just about one house. This was about how easily our stories are erased, our rights ignored. But we're writ powerless. We are not invisible. The crowd clapped, some people in tears, others holding signs that read "Justice for Jeanette." As she stepped down to meet them, people embraced her. Some whispered their own foreclosure stories. Others just said, "Thank you." And for the first time since this all began, Malika smiled. Not because it was over, but because she knew she had only just begun. The headlines came fast. Black woman without law degree exposes mortgage fraud in court. Malika Rivers' name trended locally, and her inbox flooded with messages, some from strangers thanking her, others from homeowners in similar situations, and a few from attorneys who admitted they were humbled by her performance. But even as the public praised her, Malika remained grounded. This was never about fame, it was about her mother, about justice, and about stopping what should have never happened in the first place. A week after the final ruling, Malika returned to the house. Her mother's house now quiet, dust settling on picture frames, and sunbeams stretching across the hardwood floor. She stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the floral print armchair her mom used to sit in, sipping tea and humming old jazz tunes. For the first time in months, Malika felt peace, not because everything was perfect, but because something deeply wrong had been made right. Then came the letter, folded neatly in a white envelope, stamped with a state seal. It was from the Attorney General's office. Inside was a formal acknowledgement. A task force had been formed to investigate Unified National Bank and other lenders for systemic foreclosure fraud. Her case had triggered a statewide probe. Malika's heart pounded as she read the final line. "Your efforts have been instrumental in opening this inquiry. We may reach out for further assistance as proceedings continue." She placed the letter on her mother's dining table and sat down slowly. What started as a personal mission had now become a movement. A few days later, she was invited to speak at a local community center in Atlanta. The auditorium wasn't massive, but it was packed. Families, students, activists, even housing attorneys showed up. As Malika walked to the front of the stage, applause echoed off the walls. She took a breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "I wasn't supposed to win," she said plainly. "Everything was designed to make me feel small, so that I'd quit before I even started. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't have a big law firm or a courtroom voice. All I had were questions and the determination to find answers." People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Others leaned in closer. "They told me the foreclosure was final, that I couldn't do anything, that the paperwork was too complicated, the system too far gone. But they forgot one thing. I grew up watching my mom fight for what mattered. She taught me that when you stand up with truth on your side, even the biggest machine can break." That was the moment the room shifted. Not because of the words, but because of the truth behind them. Malika wasn't just a speaker. She was living proof that one person could challenge a system and win. After the event, a woman in her 60s approached Malika, her eyes brimming. "They took my house in 2021, she said, voice cracking. "No one would help me. But watching you, it gave me hope." Malika took her hands gently. "It's not too late. If they did it to you, we can fight it. You're not alone." By the end of the month, Malika had been approached by a civil rights legal group, offering to sponsor her through law school. She hadn't planned on becoming a lawyer, but now it made sense. Not because of the prestige, but because she had seen how powerful the law could be when used to protect, not punish. One evening, as she stood in the backyard of her childhood home, the Georgia twilight wrapping the trees in gold and purple, Malika looked up at the stars. She thought of her mother, how she used to point out constellations and say, "Even when you can't see the path, just keep moving forward, the light always catches up." Now that light lived in her. She had fought alone, but she had never been truly alone. Her mother's strength, her community's support, her own quiet resilience, they had carried her through, and if the system ever came knocking again, she wouldn't just be ready. She'd be waiting. In a world where systems are often designed to silence the unheard, Ada New reminds us that courage doesn't need a title, and justice doesn't always wear a suit. Malika Rivers proved that with determination, truth, and a little grit, even a single voice can shake the walls of power. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Malika's fight wasn't just about one home, It was about refusing to be erased, about making the invisible visible. Her story is a mirror asking, what would you do if the system came for what you love most? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. This channel isn't just telling stories, we're building a community that believes in truth, resilience, and standing up when it matters most. You're part of that. Stay with us.